The sleek glass facade of James Caldwell Enterprises gleamed under the midday sun, a towering symbol of power and ambition. James Caldwell, now in his late 50s, was a man whose life had been built on strategic decisions and unwavering focus. He had spent decades constructing his empire, prioritizing profit over people and leaving no room for distractions. One such distraction had been a woman named Laura. Years earlier, Laura had entered James's life during a brief chapter when he was still clawing his way up the corporate ladder. Their whirlwind romance was passionate but fleeting, ending abruptly when Laura revealed she was pregnant. "That child isn't mine," James had said coldly, dismissing her tearful plea as nothing more than manipulation. Without hesitation, he handed her a check, a final gesture to sever ties, and walked away without so much as a second thought for Laura, or the child she carried. For Laura, James's rejection was a crushing blow, but she refused to let it define her. Determined to carve out a life without his help, she moved to a small, quiet town and found work as a personal assistant to Henry Deo, a wealthy and reclusive businessman. Over the years, Laura became more than just an employee to Henry Deo. She became a trusted confidant. Her resilience and sharp mind earned her his respect and trust, and together, they built a working relationship that would later shape her son's future. As she raised Ethan, Laura instilled in him a core belief. "You don't need anyone who doesn't want you. We make our own way in this world." Ethan took those words to heart. From a young age, he displayed a natural talent for business and a fierce independence that caught Henry Deo's attention. Ethan grew up in an environment where hard work and integrity were paramount, guided by Laura's wisdom and Deo's mentorship. While Laura and Ethan were quietly building their lives, James Caldwell thrived in the ruthless world of corporate America. His empire expanded rapidly, his name synonymous with power and wealth. He married Clarissa, a glamorous socialite who perfectly complemented his image as a successful businessman. Together, they projected the illusion of a flawless power couple, gracing the covers of magazines and attending exclusive galas. Behind the polished exterior, however, trouble was brewing. Clarissa's lavish spending and insatiable appetite for luxury strained James's finances. As his wealth was funneled into maintaining their extravagant lifestyle, his business ventures grew riskier in an effort to sustain the image of invincibility he had carefully cultivated. The cracks in James's empire began to widen quietly, almost imperceptibly at first. Whispers of poor investments and failing subsidiaries swirled through the corporate world, but James dismissed them as baseless rumors. By the time he recognized the scale of the financial hemorrhaging, his once mighty company was teetering on the brink of collapse. Desperate to save his legacy, James searched frantically for a financial lifeline. He needed a partner with the capital to stabilize his company and the vision to help rebuild it. His prayers seemed answered when an anonymous bidder expressed interest in investing a significant sum into Caldwell Enterprises. James's curiosity about the identity of this mysterious benefactor was outweighed by his desperation. Whoever they were offering the salvation he needed, and James was willing to accept their terms without hesitation. The meeting was scheduled in a sleek, glass-walled conference room high above the bustling streets of Manhattan. James Caldwell meticulously prepared, determined to present himself as a visionary worth investing in. Dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, his confidence radiated as he strode into the room, ready to charm his way to salvation. Across the table sat a young man in his early 30s, his sharp yet understated suit emphasizing his composed demeanor. Despite his youth, the man exuded an air of calm authority that immediately unsettled James. "Mr. Caldwell," the man began, his voice steady and assured. "I've reviewed your proposal, and I must admit, it's an intriguing opportunity." James smiled, leaning forward with practiced ease. "I assure you, mister," he paused, realizing he didn't have the man's name. "Ethan," the man replied, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Ethan Moore." The name meant nothing to James, and he continued his pitch with the same polished enthusiasm, unaware of the storm brewing on the other side of the table. Ethan listened quietly, his expression unreadable, giving no indication of what he was thinking. When James finally finished, Ethan leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers as he spoke. "I'm prepared to invest," Ethan said evenly, "but there's something I need to address before we proceed." James's heart leapt at the words. He straightened in his seat, eager to accommodate. "Of course," James said quickly. "Anything you need." Ethan reached into his briefcase and pulled out a photograph, sliding it across the polished table. James froze, his breath catching in his throat as he stared at the image. There was no mistaking it. It was a younger version of himself standing beside Laura. "What is this?" James demanded, his voice tight. He already knew the answer, but his mind scrambled to deny it. Ethan's faint smile remained steady, his eyes locked on James's. "That's you and my mother," Ethan said calmly. "I'm your son, Mr. Caldwell, the one you denied 3 decades ago." The air in the room grew impossibly heavy as James stared at the photograph, his pulse racing. Memories he had buried long ago began to surface, each one sharper and more haunting than the last. This can't be," James stammered, his voice cracking under the weight of realization. "Oh, it can," Ethan replied, his tone now as icy as his glare. "And it is." James struggled to regain his composure, but the truth hit him like a tidal wave. The man sitting across from him wasn't just any investor. He was the son James had abandoned decades ago, now grown into a poised and successful businessman. "I don't understand," James mumbled, the words barely audible. How did you?" Ethan leaned forward, cutting him off, his expression unyielding. "How did I end up here?" he said sharply. "It's simple. My mother raised me to be better than you. She taught me resilience, independence, and integrity, qualities you clearly lack. And then there was Henry Deo, her employer. He saw my potential and decided to mentor me. When he passed, he left me his entire fortune and business empire." James's mind reeled, the name hitting him like a punch to the gut. Henry Deo's wealth was the stuff of legend, whispered about in the highest echelons of business, rumored to be worth billions. That fortune was now in the hands of the son James had dismissed without a second thought. Ethan's gaze bore into James, unrelenting. "You built your empire by stepping on people," Ethan continued, his voice steady but laced with quiet fury, "including your own blood. And now here you are, begging for help. The irony, of course," he added, a faint smirk curling at the corners of his mouth, "is that the only reason I'm even entertaining this conversation is because my mother taught me to rise above bitterness." James opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. His throat tightened, his carefully constructed confidence crumbling under the weight of Ethan's words. For the first time in his life, James Caldwell was completely at a loss. "I'll consider your proposal," Ethan said, rising from his chair. His tone was controlled, but the authority in his voice was unmistakable. James leaned forward, desperate. "Name it," he said quickly. Ethan's expression hardened as he stared at the man who had abandoned him. "I want an apology," Ethan said firmly. "A real one. Not just to me, but to my mother, publicly." James froze, the gravity of Ethan's demand sinking in. For decades, he had dismissed Laura and their child as irrelevant to his life, a decision made without hesitation. Now, faced with the depth of the pain he had caused, James realized just how steep the price of redemption would be. Sitting in the back seat of his chauffeured car later that day, James stared blankly out the window as the city rushed past him. His mind replayed the meeting with Ethan in an endless loop, the photograph, the cold realization, and his son's unflinching demand for accountability. His son. The thought was almost too much to process. Ethan, the child he had denied, had grown into the powerful, successful investor James now needed to save his company. The bitter irony of the situation gnawed at him, but it was Ethan's ultimatum that stung the most, a public apology. For years, James had lived with a philosophy that regrets were useless and mistakes were simply lessons to move on from. He had built an empire without looking back, pushing past missteps and disregarding those left in his wake. But now, with everything on the line, he had no choice but to face the ghosts of his past. The car pulled into the long driveway of his mansion, a sprawling estate that had once been a monument to his achievements. Now it felt hollow, a crumbling facade barely masking the cracks in his life. Clarissa met him at the door, her arms crossed and her sharp gaze narrowing as she took in his disheveled appearance. "Rough day?" she asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. James ignored her, brushing past and heading straight to his study. Once inside, he locked the door behind him, needing solitude to think. He sank into his leather chair, staring at the dark wood desk that had served as the command center of his empire for years. No matter how many scenarios he played out in his mind, they all pointed to the same conclusion. If he wanted to save everything he had built, he would have to do the one thing he had avoided for decades. He would have to apologize. The next morning, James's public relations team gathered in the sleek conference room of Caldwell Enterprises, summoned for what he had called an urgent meeting. Tension filled the air as James addressed them, his voice tight and uncharacteristically strained. "I need to issue a formal apology to someone I wronged in the past," James said, choosing his words carefully to avoid revealing Ethan's identity. Vanessa, his astute and no-nonsense PR manager, raised a questioning eyebrow. "A public apology? That's unexpected," she said, her tone laced with curiosity. "That's not exactly your usual style. Mr. Caldwell, who's the target audience?" James hesitated for a fraction of a second before replying. "It's personal," he said curtly. "Let's just say it's crucial for the future of the company." Vanessa exchanged glances with her team, clearly intrigued but smart enough not to press further. "Understood," she said briskly. "We'll draft a statement and arrange a press conference. If we position this as a gesture of humility and accountability, it could actually improve your public image." James nodded stiffly, though the word humility grated against his pride like nails on a chalkboard. He would do what needed to be done, even if it meant swallowing his ego. Meanwhile, Ethan sat in his penthouse apartment, gazing out at the sprawling city skyline. Beside him, a photo of Laura rested on the table, a constant reminder of her resilience, her love, and the sacrifices she had made for him. Though years had passed since her death, her influence on Ethan's life remained unshakable. Everything he had achieved, his education, his career, and his quiet strength, was rooted in her unwavering determination to prove they didn't need anyone who didn't value them. When James Caldwell's apology aired on every major news outlet, Ethan watched from his living room with an expression of calm detachment. The press conference was flawlessly orchestrated, with James standing behind a polished podium, his face grave and composed. Flashing cameras illuminated the room, but for once, the man who had built an empire on confidence and power seemed smaller, stripped of his usual arrogance. "I want to take this opportunity to acknowledge mistakes I've made in my past," James began, his voice steady but measured. "Years ago, I dismissed a claim of paternity without giving it the consideration it deserved. I was wrong. My actions caused pain and hardship to someone who didn't deserve it. To that person and their family, I am deeply sorry." The room fell silent except for the clicking of cameras capturing the moment. To an outsider, the apology might have seemed sincere. But to Ethan it felt polished, rehearsed, and lacking the raw honesty he had hoped for. It was a start, perhaps, but far from the heartfelt reckoning he believed his mother deserved. As the press conference concluded, Ethan's phone buzzed with a message. It was from James. "I hope this is enough for us to move forward." Ethan stared at the words, his mind swirling with conflicting emotions. Laura's voice echoed in his memory. "Rising above bitterness doesn't mean forgetting. It means choosing your battles." After a long pause, Ethan typed his reply. "Meet me tomorrow at Deo Tower. Noon sharp." The next day, James arrived at Deo Tower, a gleaming monument to power and success. Walking into the grand lobby, he couldn't help but feel a stab of inadequacy. This was Ethan's domain, An empire built on the foundation laid by Henry Deo and strengthened by Ethan's undeniable talent and vision. The receptionist guided James to a conference room on the top floor. The space was modern and immaculate, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city. Ethan was waiting, his demeanor cool but professional. "I saw the press conference," Ethan said, gesturing for James to take a seat. James sat down, feeling a rare sense of unease, like a schoolboy about to face his teacher's reprimand. "I meant every word," James said, his voice faltering slightly. Even as he spoke, he wasn't entirely sure if it was true. Ethan tilted his head, scrutinizing James with a look that was both calculating and unreadable. "I'll admit, it was better than I expected," Ethan said finally. "But there's still something left to address." James frowned, his unease deepening. "What do you mean?" he asked cautiously. Ethan leaned forward, his gaze sharp and unwavering. "You apologized to the public," Ethan said, his voice steady. "But you didn't apologize to me or to my mother. I want to hear it directly from you." James's throat tightened. He was not accustomed to being confronted, especially not by someone young enough to be his son, his actual son. As he looked into Ethan's eyes, though, he was struck by the unmistakable resemblance. It wasn't just physical. Ethan carried the same determination and ambition that James had prided himself on in his youth. But there was something else, too, a pain and betrayal that James knew he had caused. Drawing in a deep breath, James forced himself to speak. "Ethan," he began, his voice quieter than usual. "I'm sorry. For everything. For denying you, for abandoning your mother, and for not being the man I should have been. I was selfish and short-sighted, and I regret it deeply." For a moment, the room was silent. Ethan's expression gave nothing away, but after a long pause, he nodded slightly. "Thank you," he said simply. James exhaled, the tension in his chest easing for the first time in what felt like years. For a brief moment, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time, a glimmer of hope. The meeting continued, with Ethan outlining the terms of his investment in Coldwell Enterprises. The deal came with a steep condition. Ethan would retain majority control of the company, effectively making James a subordinate in the very empire he had built. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but James knew he had no choice. Without Ethan's support, his company and everything he had worked for would collapse. As James left Deo Tower, stepping out into the bustling city streets, he was overwhelmed by a mixture of relief and humiliation. The investment was secured, but it had come at a great cost. His pride was in shreds, and the empire he had spent his life building now rested in the hands of the son he had once dismissed as insignificant. It was a cruel twist of fate, but one James could no longer ignore. James walked into the Coldwell Enterprises boardroom with an uneasy but renewed sense of purpose. The walls of the room, once a testament to his authority, now seemed to close in on him. The company was his creation, yet every decision from this point forward required approval from Ethan Moore, his son, and now the majority shareholder. The terms of Ethan's investment had been clear. He wasn't merely a financial backer. He intended to reshape the company from the ground up. For James, it was a bitter pill to swallow. His future, and the future of his life's work, was now in the hands of the son he had abandoned decades ago. When Ethan arrived at the board meeting, his entrance was understated but carried undeniable authority. The directors, many of whom had been fiercely loyal to James, sat silent, their curiosity and apprehension evident as they watched the new dynamic unfold. Effective immediately, Ethan began, his tone calm but commanding. "Coldwell Enterprises will undergo significant restructuring. We'll focus on sustainable investments and ethical business practices. The days of reckless spending and short-term gains are over." James shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Each word felt like a direct critique of his leadership style, and he could feel the weight of the director's eyes on him. The legacy he had built with ambition and control was being redefined before his very eyes. Swallowing his pride, James forced himself to nod in agreement. though every fiber of his being resisted the shift in power. In the weeks that followed, the changes Ethan implemented began to bear fruit. The company's finances stabilized, long-neglected divisions were revitalized, and employee morale improved. James couldn't deny the results, but the sting of his diminished role lingered. He often found himself sitting in his office, staring at the nameplate on his desk, James Caldwell, founder. Once a symbol of triumph, it now felt like a relic, a faint echo of a past that no longer seemed to matter. One afternoon, Ethan entered James's office without knocking, carrying a folder in his hand and a thoughtful expression on his face. "Got a minute?" Ethan asked, closing the door behind him. James gestured toward the chair across from his desk. "Of course," he said, though the uncertainty in his tone betrayed him. "What's on your mind?" Ethan sat down, placing the folder on the desk between them. "There's something I need to show you," Ethan said, sliding it toward James. James opened the folder, his heart sinking as he scanned the papers inside. They were old legal documents, some of them bearing his own signature. His hands trembled as he recognized what they were. The payment he had made to Laura all those years ago to distance himself from her and the child. Nestled among the documents was a handwritten note. The familiar handwriting made James's chest tighten. It was Laura's. The note read, "James, this isn't about money. This is about responsibility. I don't need your help, but one day your child might. I hope you'll reconsider when that time comes." James closed the folder, his hands trembling slightly as he placed it back on the desk. He looked up at Ethan, his voice strained. "Why are you showing me this?" Ethan leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful and measured. "I found these in my mother's things after she passed," he said quietly. "She never spoke badly of you, you know. Even after everything. She always said you had the potential to be better." James felt a lump form in his throat, guilt and regret crashing over him like a wave. She did?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. Ethan nodded. "She believed in forgiveness, even when it wasn't earned. At the time, I didn't understand it. I was angry for what you did to her and to me. But now," Ethan said, his voice softening, "I think I understand what she meant." For a long moment, neither man spoke. Laura's words, so simple yet profound, hung heavily in the room. They seemed to bridge the unspoken pain between them, a reminder of the weight of the past and the possibility of redemption. For James, it was the first glimmer of something he hadn't dared to hope for, an opportunity, however fragile, to mend what he had broken. As the months passed, James committed himself to rebuilding his relationship with Ethan. No longer the commanding founder, James approached meetings with humility, offering guidance when asked and learning to respect Ethan's leadership. It was an unfamiliar role for him, but he understood the importance of this shift, not just for the company but for his chance at redemption. It wasn't an easy transition. The habits of a lifetime were hard to break, and there were moments when James faltered, his old arrogance creeping in. But each time, he reminded himself of Laura's words in the letter Ethan had shown him. This is about responsibility. Ethan remained cautious, his demeanor still guarded, but he wasn't unkind. He acknowledged James's efforts and allowed their tentative partnership to grow. As they tackled the challenges of Caldwell Enterprises' transformation, their interactions began to feel less transactional and more personal. Slowly but surely, they started forging the foundation of a father-son bond that neither had expected. One day, Ethan surprised James with an invitation to a private event at Deo Tower. The invitation was vague, simply calling it a celebration of resilience. Intrigued, James arrived to find an elegant gathering of Ethan's closest associates and supporters. The atmosphere was warm but understated, with soft music and heartfelt conversations filling the room. James mingled quietly, unsure of what to expect. Then, as the evening reached its peak, Ethan took the stage to deliver a speech. James stood at the back of the room, listening intently, not expecting to be mentioned. "There's someone here tonight who taught me the most valuable lesson I've ever learned," Ethan began, his voice clear and steady. The room quieted as his words hung in the air. That it's never too late to change. That redemption isn't about erasing the past, but about taking responsibility for it. Ethan's gaze swept across the audience before landing on James. "Dad," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion, "this company wouldn't exist without you. And while we've had our differences, I want you to know, I'm proud to be your son." The room erupted into applause, but James barely registered it. His vision blurred as tears filled his eyes. He hadn't realized how much he needed to hear those words until now. After the event, James approached Ethan, his voice shaky but resolute. "Thank you," James said, his words catching in his throat. "I don't deserve it, but thank you." Ethan smiled, his expression warm and genuine. "You're trying," Ethan replied. "That's what matters." In that moment, James felt a peace he hadn't known in years. He understood that while he couldn't rewrite the past, he had the power to help shape the future. And for the first time, he wasn't building for himself, he was building for his son. Under Ethan's leadership, Coldwell Enterprises flourished. The company became known not just for its success, but for its commitment to innovation and integrity. James remained involved in a reduced capacity, finding fulfillment not in wielding power, but in supporting Ethan's vision. Ethan, meanwhile, honored Laura's legacy by establishing the Laura Moore Foundation, dedicated to supporting single parents and their children. At the foundation's inaugural event, James stood beside Ethan, pride swelling in his chest as he watched his son carry forward Laura's values. The journey to reconciliation hadn't been easy, but James and Ethan had found their way back to each other. In the end, it wasn't the wealth or power that defined their relationship. It was the forgiveness and love they had fought so hard to reclaim.